you play guitar at all, you've spent any time messing around with guitar amps or tones or pedals or effects or anything, you probably know about reverb. Most of you watching this channel probably have at least one reverb pedal or an amp with a built-in reverb. And like me, it might be one of your favorite effects. I love reverb. I use it all the time. It can do a lot. It's an incredibly versatile and useful tool, not just for guitar players, but for sound design and mixing and producing in general. But it can be a little bit confusing. It can be a little overwhelming. There's tons of different types of reverbs and how to know when to use a reverb and what type and how much. I mean, there's a lot to it. And especially for guitar players, reverbs can get out of hand pretty quickly and cause muddy tone. They can cause you to get buried in a mix. And in general, I think this is one of the effects that a lot of guitar players, especially people that are new to the electric guitar and starting to figure out their tone and their sound, this is one of the things that can really overwhelm people and kind of confuse them. So in today's video, we're gonna talk about reverb for guitar, how to use reverb on guitar, reverb pedals, reverb plugins, natural room reverb. And I'm gonna teach you basically everything I know about using reverb effectively. So before we get started, click subscribe down below, hit the bell to be notified when I'm posting new videos and starting to do live streams again here on this channel now that I'm in the new space. And also, if you're interested in guitar tone and learning more about guitar tone and amps and effects and how they all work together, I made a video course on that last year called the Tone Course. And if you click through the link in the description box down below, you'll get 20% off of the Tone Course. All right. Let's jump in and start talking about reverb. What is it? Now, I think in order to get the most out of the reverb effect as a guitar player, it helps to have an understanding of what reverb actually is, what it's doing, and the different types of reverbs that we have available to us as guitar players today. So, reverb is a really simple concept. It's simply the continuation of a sound or sound waves that build up after reflections off of surfaces after the sound stops. Now, reverb is around us all the time. Obviously, any room you're in or even outside, you're hearing sound reflections bouncing off of surfaces hitting your ears at different intervals. And that is something that the human brain actually accounts for. And it's so common that in most of our daily lives, we don't really even notice it. In fact, we've become so accustomed to it. If you've ever seen videos of people in anechoic chambers, completely soundproof rooms, everyone seems to have the same kind of sensation of feeling really strange, really out of place, and it can actually cause auditory hallucinations. Mary Spender did a video on this a couple years ago that I'll link down below. It's really fascinating. Now, there's several different types of reverb that you're gonna encounter when it comes to reverb as a guitar effect. The first and most common and natural one is the actual natural space, the room reverb that you might be playing in at the time. This can be your bedroom, this can be a venue, or in some high-end studios like Abbey Road or Capitol Studios in LA, they actually built chambers deep underground underneath the studio, these large rooms with nothing but reflective surfaces and curved corners, and where they would actually pump in the sound of whatever they wanted to reverberate, vocal or a guitar sound or drum sound, and pick that up with mics. And nowadays there's plugins that will emulate that. Next up, we have plate reverbs. Now, plates are really fascinating. A plate reverb literally is just a plate of metal with a transducer attached to it that feeds the signal of whatever you're trying to reverberate, and the plate actually moves. It actually vibrates, creating the reverb, where a contact microphone is attached to the other end of the plate, essentially picking up the reverb. This is also a really famous studio tool. The EMT 140 is the most common and most well-known of these plate reverbs, and there's actually a pedal we're gonna look at today that emulates the EMT 140. And plate reverbs are fantastic on guitars. They can be really smooth and really warm, or they can be bright and metallic sounding. Plates are some of my favorites to use, especially for ambient reverbs. Then we have the spring reverb. Now, as a guitar player, you're probably the most familiar with the spring reverb. If you have a Fender amp, for example, you probably have some kind of spring reverb in your amp itself. Now, spring reverbs are some of my favorites. I've got a great spring reverb in my tape echo here that I'll show you in a minute, but they are known for giving you that drip, as it's known. The surf guitar, the Dick Dale thing. Spring reverbs are ubiquitous with guitar sounds, and again, they're some of my favorites to use. And then you're gonna have digital reverbs. Now, digital reverbs are kind of a wide gamut. You can have things like the Lexicon 224, which was a famous studio digital reverb from the 1980s that was used on all kinds of records. And that was a digital unit that was meant to emulate room sounds. They were using digital technology, primitive digital technology, to emulate large halls or cathedrals or caves even. But modern digital reverbs from Strymon or Source Audio or Eventide, for example, will do more than just the vintage 80s digital reverbs did. They can emulate springs, they can emulate plates, they can emulate reverbs that don't exist, like Eventide's black hole algorithm, for example. Digital reverbs are fantastic for getting those experimental sort of sound design reverbs. Okay, so one of the most important things to understand when it comes to reverb for guitar is pre-delay. Now, a lot of reverb pedals that you buy today will have a pre-delay control on them, and it's important that you understand it because this is what makes the difference between a really muddy, washy reverb that buries your guitar in the mix and something that sounds nice and lush and full. Especially when you start getting into ambient reverbs and more ethereal sounding stuff, when you want to preserve the tone of your guitar and you want to cut through the mix with that reverb still there, it's all about pre-delay. So if you look down here on my test pedal board of science, you can see I've got the golden reverberator from UA. This is on loan to me from UA. And I think this is a pretty good example of what we're talking about. I've got a Plate EMT 140 reverb pulled up here, and right now it's just set up for kind of a nice sort of warm, lush, I would say like a medium Plate sound. And I'm going directly out of the pedal into the front of a clean amp back there. So what we're gonna do is dial up this reverb to make it more of like an ambient sort of ethereal thing. So I've brought up the decay time, so the reverb's gonna last longer, and I'm bringing up the mix, and now this is what we have. Now that's a lot of reverb, and especially because I'm on the neck pickup of this gold top here, you can tell it's starting to bury the guitar. It's getting really muddy and washy. But this middle control here, this is the pre-delay. Now, what pre-delay does is control the amount of time between the initial transient or the attack of the note and when the reverb actually comes in. So with the pre-delay all the way down right now, you're gonna hear the reverb come in immediately after I pick a note. There's no delay there. As soon as I play a note, the reverb is filling in underneath. So what I'm gonna do is bring my pre-delay up to give me a little bit of a gap. Ideally what I wanna have is the note come through nice and clear and then the reverb fill in underneath. And again, this is really useful for these big, washy, long, lush reverbs like this. So that's better, but it's still not there. It's still really muddy and really washy. So I'm gonna bring that pre-delay really high up on this pedal. becomes really apparent on that single note stuff because the initial attack of the note is coming through. So you can hear the tone of the guitar, you can hear the timbre of the actual note, and then the reverb is coming in behind it to sort of fill in the space underneath. Now this is a lot of reverb. In reality, I probably wouldn't use this much. In fact, I'd probably dial this in to something a little bit closer to this kind of sound and then do a similar picking part. Now, interestingly, with room reverbs, pre-delay is how you can actually dial in the size or the sense of the size of the room. Pre-delay actually happens in a real space. The bigger the space, the more pre-delay there actually is. There's more time between the sound source emitting the sound and the reflections coming back in the larger room. So a pre-delay control on a room reverb sound can actually make the room feel bigger or smaller depending on what you're going for. Now, I'm a bit of a reverb junkie. If anyone who's watching this video has gigged with me at all, you probably know that I tend to use a lot of reverb, sometimes too much reverb. And this is a lesson that I've learned myself over the last few years, when not to use your reverb. See, a lot of players, myself included, can begin to rely on the reverb. You can kind of use it as a bit of a crutch, especially when it's like a nice luscious spring that's built into your amp. You can sort of use it to kind of hide your crimes, if you will. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I've done that for years and I still like to play with reverb, but there's a few situations to look out for where it's actually better to turn the reverb off. First one that comes to mind for me is if you're at a gig and you're in a venue, let's say you're in a club or a small theater or a bar that has a natural sort of short decay room reverb. If you're playing in a space like that, on a stage like that, you don't need to use a reverb that's always on. Instead, you might use it as an effect or a color. You might use a nice ambient digital reverb, or you might use something that's gonna call out or stand out as a character effect. But I would not use a room reverb, for example, because you're in a room. There's no reason to add on to what's already naturally happening in that room. Again, ask me how I know. The other thing to look out for is when you're recording or playing rhythm guitar parts, specifically guitar parts that are overdriven. Check this out. All right, so let's say you're playing a rhythm part and you want something that's nice and tight. You're gonna do like a palm muting driving rhythm part. I've got some gain dialed into the amp here. That is amp overdrive, not coming from a pedal. So you've got this part in the song that's like a pretty straight ahead palm muting part. We've all done it a million times. Now listen to what happens when I kick on this spring reverb. Now that is an extreme example, and it's made worse by the fact that I'm using a pedal going into the front of an overdriven amp. That leads me to my next point, where to put your reverb in your signal chain. There's a few different options, and they both have different effects. Where you end up putting your reverb in your signal chain has a massive impact on its sound and what it's gonna do. And it's important to consider based off of what you're looking to get out of your reverb sound. Now, most guitar players, myself included, tend to use a reverb pedal on their board just going into the front end of a tube amp, which is what I'm doing right now. I've got the Golden set up using the digital delay setting, the Lexicon 224 setting, and I've got it going straight into the front of a tube amp that is slightly overdriven. And again, that's not coming from an overdrive pedal, that's coming from the actual amp itself. Now listen to what happens when I turn the reverb on. I've got a pretty heavy-handed digital reverb here because I really want to show you the difference between the two. You can hear the reverb trails themselves are actually pretty distorted. They're pretty overdriven, which makes sense because it's going into the front end of an overdriven amp. So let's say I wanted something that was a cleaner reverb sound. I wanted the tone of the amp to come through, but I wanted the reverb trails to be nice and clean and not distorted and affected by the amp's tone. Well, then you would put your reverb after the amp. Now, in an actual amp, this would mean using an effects loop if your amp is equipped with one, effectively giving it a cleaner overall output, a cleaner signal. Now, I made a whole video on effects loops a few years ago. You can check out up here if you're interested. But what I've actually got going on here is a reverb plugin, the same Lexicon 224 plugin from the same company, UA. Although they are slightly different, the algorithm in the pedal is a little bit different than the plugin, so this is not a completely fair comparison, but I did my best to kind of dial in the same type of reverb sound between the two, and you should hear what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna play the pedal into the front of the amp, and then I'm gonna mute that and play the actual plugin that's after the amp, and you should be able to hear the difference. So in that example, you can tell the difference. They are completely different sounds, not to mention the fact that that's in stereo, this is in mono, but that has all of the fidelity still intact. It's got basically the entire range of the reverb trail, the whole frequency response of the reverb trail intact, whereas the pedal going into the front of the amp is being colored and affected by the preamp section itself. Again, that's not a bad thing. It just depends on what you're looking for. I actually think the pedal going into the front of the amp sounds really cool, and that's typically how I run it. But depending on what you're looking for, where you place the pedal or the effect in the chain has a massive difference on its response. So that's how to use reverb on guitar, at least how I think about using reverb on guitar. Let me know what you thought about today's video in the comments section down below. What's your favorite reverb? How do you like to run it in your signal chain? Do you play it through your effects loop, or do you even use reverb at all? I know there's a lot of guitar players out there that don't even touch it, which I think is a shame because it's such a versatile and useful effect. You can do so much more with a good reverb than just big washy ambient tones, but that's another video. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, you can check out the links in the description box down below. I'll have links to the gear that I used in today's video. Those will be affiliate links, so if you buy something through that, I get a small commission, which helps me out in running the channel, so thank you. Also, don't forget, if you're interested in the tone course, you can get 20% off via the discount code in the description box down below. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching and supporting and subscribing and everything. I really appreciate it. Once again, my name is Rhett Shull, and remember, there is no plan B.